My name is Tiffany, and I'm 32 years old. My parents told me my husband wasn't welcome on our family trip. When I refused to go without him, my mother smirked and said, "He's just a guest, not real family." I stayed silent, but when the trip fell apart, they finally realized what I had done. For as long as I can remember, my family has organized an annual trip, a tradition that was less about bonding and more about an unspoken rule strictly enforced by my parents. It didn't matter what was happening in our lives, work commitments, personal issues, or even major events. Attendance was mandatory. Skipping it wasn't just an absence. It was a silent act of rebellion that came with consequences. I had seen it happen before. Relatives who missed the trip, even for valid reasons, slowly became outsiders in the family. Invitations to gatherings became rare. Conversations turned cold, and eventually they faded into the background. This year's trip carried even more weight. It was my father's 50th birthday celebration. My parents had been meticulously planning every detail, making sure the guest list included everyone important. Being there wasn't just expected, it was a statement of loyalty. I had never missed a trip, and now that I was married, I saw no reason why that would change. When my parents first brought it up, they excitedly told me about the house they had rented in Palmview Estate, a spacious vacation home in the Florida Keys, the perfect setting for the big celebration. They asked me to confirm my attendance early so they could finalize the arrangements. I assured them I would go, but I would be going with my husband, Daniel. The silence that followed was unexpected. My mother, usually the first to react enthusiastically to any plan, hesitated. When she finally spoke, her tone was cautious. She said she wasn't sure if it was a good idea for Daniel to come, that the trip was just for family, and maybe it would be best if he stayed home. At first, I thought I had misheard her. It made no sense. My husband and I were family. I asked for clarification, but my father quickly stepped in, his voice firm, as if wanting to end the discussion before it escalated. He claimed it wasn't personal, that some family dynamics might be affected by an outsider's presence. His words were vague, carefully chosen, but they didn't answer my question. I pressed for a real explanation, but instead of a clear answer, my mother insisted she didn't want any tension. She said this was supposed to be a celebration, and she preferred to avoid any discomfort among the guests. That's when I realized this wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. They had already made up their minds. My parents didn't want my husband there. No matter how much I tried to understand their reasoning, all I got were excuses wrapped in concerns about family harmony. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. My parents, who had always preached about unity, about love and family above all else, were now asking me to pretend my marriage didn't exist. To act as if the man I had chosen to spend my life with wasn't worthy of being included in a family event. My mother tried to soften it, saying there was still time to think it over, that I shouldn't make a rushed decision. She insisted it was just a trip and that I was blowing things out of proportion. But for me, this wasn't just a trip. This was a test of priorities, a clear message about who they considered family and who they didn't. I made my decision quickly. If my husband wasn't welcome, then neither was I. When I told them, the silence was even heavier. My mother said my name in a tone of disappointment, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. My father, who had remained neutral until then, accused me of overreacting. He insisted my presence was important, that I shouldn't put the family in a difficult position over a whim. But this wasn't a whim, and I wasn't going to let them treat it like one. I made it clear I wasn't changing my mind. When I made it clear that I wouldn't attend if Daniel wasn't welcome, everything fell apart. My mother sent me a long message accusing me of ruining my father's birthday and reminding me that family should always come first. My brother followed, telling me he couldn't believe I was doing this, that if I truly cared about our parents, I would find a way to fix things without canceling my attendance. But what they didn't understand or refused to see was that I wasn't the problem. I had simply set a boundary. I didn't realize then that this was just the beginning. My decision wouldn't only change how my family saw me, it would shatter the illusion of harmony my parents had worked so hard to maintain. For the first few days after our conversation, there was silence. No calls, no messages, as if they were waiting for me to come to my senses and give in. I knew exactly what they were doing, letting guilt settle in, expecting me to feel the weight of my choice until I surrendered and accepted their terms. But what they failed to realize was that this time, things were different. This wasn't just a family disagreement that could be resolved with a forced apology. It was about principles, respect for my husband, my marriage, and myself. The silence didn't last long. My Aunt Catherine was the first to reach out. Her voice was laced with fake concern, but I could tell it was an attempt to manipulate me. She said she was sad I wouldn't be at the trip, that this was all just a misunderstanding, and that no one wanted to exclude Daniel. According to her, my parents were only trying to avoid conflict, to keep the peace and ensure everything went smoothly. But what unsettled me most was her excuse for their decision. She claimed it wasn't that they didn't like Daniel, just that some family members might feel uncomfortable with him there, and for that reason, it was best if he didn't come. That answer only fueled my anger. I asked her straight out who exactly felt uncomfortable. There was a pause. She clearly hadn't expected the question. Then she mumbled something vague, saying it wasn't about who had said what, but about avoiding unnecessary tension. That confirmed what I had already suspected. This wasn't about the whole family. It wasn't a shared concern. There was one person, or a few, who had a problem with my husband, and instead of defending him, my parents had chosen to side with them. I responded firmly. If family truly mattered, they shouldn't be dividing us with arbitrary exclusions. If someone had an issue with Daniel, the solution wasn't to push him away, it was to address it like adults. Catherine sighed and told me I was being stubborn, that sometimes it was better to let things go for the sake of peace. I thanked her for calling, but made it crystal clear I wasn't changing my decision. That night, my mother sent another message, even longer than before. This time, she didn't hold back. She accused me of choosing my husband over my family, of refusing to listen, of being the one causing division. She insisted they were only doing what was best for everyone. I didn't reply. By then, I knew reasoning with them was pointless. They weren't interested in listening. They just wanted me to back down. The next morning, my brother texted me again, but his tone was different. Less aggressive, more strategic. He told me he had spoken to our parents, and while they weren't happy with my decision, there was still time to fix things. He suggested I reconsider, attend the trip, let the celebration happen, and then we could talk about Daniel afterward. In other words, he wanted me to pretend none of this had happened, to show up, act like everything was fine, and deal with the issue at some vague point in the future. But I wasn't going to play along. That was the moment I realized they didn't care about my feelings or what Daniel was going through. All they wanted was to avoid a scandal, to make sure my absence wouldn't turn into an awkward topic of conversation. They just wanted the celebration to go on smoothly without disruption. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I simply replied no. No explanations. No unnecessary justifications. There was no point in dragging out the conversation. My answer wasn't going to change. After that, communication with my family became sparse, but every message I received carried an underlying attempt to manipulate me. First, my mother insisted I was making an impulsive decision and that I still had time to change my mind. Then Catherine reached out again, warning me that I'd regret distancing myself over something so small. Finally, my brother sent one last message, not outright threatening me, but making it clear that if I didn't back down, our relationship would never be the same. By then, I was certain there was no turning back. But what none of us realized at the time was that this conflict was about to escalate in ways we never expected. The silence that followed my refusal felt like a temporary truce, but I knew better. My family never let things go, especially when something threatened the fragile illusion of unity they worked so hard to maintain. Days passed without messages or calls. On the surface, everything seemed calm, but deep down, I had a nagging feeling that something else was happening behind the scenes. The way my mother had insisted, the way my brother had tried to negotiate, the way my aunt had carefully chosen her words, it all pointed to a hidden reason behind their decision to exclude Daniel. That suspicion was confirmed when I got an unexpected call from Andrew, one of my cousins. We had never been particularly close, but we got along well enough. Unlike the others, he didn't sound condescending like my mother, or passive-aggressive like my brother. He sounded uncomfortable, as if debating whether to tell me what he knew. After a brief pause, he finally admitted the truth. It wasn't some family members who had a problem with Daniel. It wasn't about family dynamics or avoiding discomfort. It was one person, Jessica, my brother's wife. At first, I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding. But the more Andrew explained, the more everything made sense. He told me Jessica had opposed Daniel's presence from the start, going directly to my parents and making it clear she didn't want him there. Instead of shutting her down and reminding her that she had no right to decide who was part of the family, my parents had listened. and at some point, they had chosen to take her side. Her hostility toward Daniel wasn't new. It had been building for years. Andrew reminded me of little moments I had overlooked, how Jessica had made snide remarks about Daniel's clothes at family events, how she had accused him of trying to outshine others at gatherings, how she had once scoffed at his presence during Christmas, implying that Daniel always wanted to be the center of attention. But the worst part wasn't the things she had said in the past. It was what she had done recently. Andrew told me that in a conversation not long ago, Jessica had outright declared that if Daniel was going, she wouldn't be attending. And instead of pushing back, my parents caved. They had chosen to sacrifice my husband to keep Jessica happy. A wave of anger surged through me. I couldn't believe how absurd this was. Jessica, someone with no authority over our family, had manipulated my parents to the point where they were willing to exclude my husband from the trip. And instead of standing up for what was right, they had surrendered to her demands. For a moment, I said nothing. I felt a mix of rage and disappointment deeper than anything I had felt before. This wasn't just about the trip anymore. It was about betrayal. At this point, it wasn't about whether we went or not. It was about the fact that my own parents had decided my husband was disposable, that keeping Jessica happy was more important than respecting my marriage. When I finally spoke, my voice was colder than I expected. I thanked Andrew for telling me the truth, but I made one thing clear. If they thought I was just going to accept this, they were wrong. After hanging up, I sat in silence, trying to process everything. I thought about all the times Jessica had subtly undermined Daniel, how she had turned every gathering into some petty competition, how my brother had never once intervened. I thought about my parents, how they had ignored what was right, choosing to appease someone toxic instead of standing their ground. I wasn't going to let this go. If they were willing to show me where their priorities lay, then I would show them mine, and this time there would be no turning back. The days that followed Andrew's revelation were filled with quiet anger that only strengthened my resolve. I couldn't let my family think they could make such a cruel decision without facing consequences. For years, they had preached about unity, about loyalty, but now it was clear those values only applied when it suited them. They had chosen to prioritize Jessica, someone who was nothing more than my brother's wife, over me and my marriage. I cut off all contact. If they didn't feel the need to offer me an honest explanation, then I had no interest in speaking to them. Daniel, though he didn't say it outright, felt the tension too. I hadn't told him everything. I didn't want to hurt him more than he already was, but he knew something deeper was going on. He didn't press me, maybe because he knew the truth would come out eventually. The breaking point came when I received an unexpected call from my mother. Until that moment, I had thought maybe, just maybe, they would make a real attempt to fix things, that they would at least try to reason with me in a way that made sense. But the moment she started talking, I knew the real reason she was reaching out. She spoke in a calm, almost casual tone, as if nothing had happened. She said she hoped I had taken time to think things through, that I would realize this whole situation had gotten out of control. She talked about how much it meant to them for me to be there, how my absence would cast a shadow over the celebration, how my father just wanted the whole family together for his birthday. For a moment, I almost felt something, a glimpse of the connection we once had, but that feeling vanished as soon as she said what she really wanted to say. She admitted she understood my point of view, but said it wasn't that simple, that sometimes, in families, sacrifices had to be made for the sake of harmony. Her words were carefully chosen to make me feel like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was the one blowing things out of proportion. Then she made her offer. She suggested I come to the trip anyway, put everything aside for now, and when I returned, we could talk about it calmly. As if this was just a misunderstanding, as if it could all be resolved with a simple conversation. I listened in silence, giving her no indication of what I was thinking. When she finally paused, waiting for me to respond, I decided I wasn't holding back anymore. I asked her if she really thought I didn't know the truth. If she and my father really believed they could hide what had happened and manipulate me into thinking Daniel simply didn't fit in. The shift in her tone was instant. Before she could respond, I pressed on. I told her I knew Jessica was the one who had demanded Daniel be excluded, that instead of telling her she had no right to make that decision, they had chosen to go along with it. Then I asked the question that had been burning inside me. If Jessica had threatened not to come, why hadn't she been the one left out? Why was her presence more important than the man I had chosen to spend my life with? I didn't expect her to admit it, but she did in the most cowardly way possible. She said it wasn't that simple, that they hadn't wanted to cause more conflict, that things with my brother and Jessica were complicated, and they didn't want the trip to turn into a battle. She tried to justify it as a way to avoid more problems, But she didn't understand. They had already created one. I told my mother that by making their choice, they had made their loyalties clear. I calmly stated that I had made the right decision by refusing to go. If they wanted to run the family under arbitrary rules, they needed to be ready for the consequences. If Daniel wasn't family to them, then neither was I. I hung up before she could respond. Less than an hour later, the news spread. To my surprise, my grandmother, one of the few family members who had always remained neutral, took a stand. She was the matriarch, the one who held everyone together. And when she found out what had happened, she was furious. She called my parents and told them their behavior was disgraceful. Excluding Daniel over Jessica's demands was unacceptable, but she didn't stop there. As a form of protest, she canceled her attendance at the trip. That was the breaking point. Her decision set off a chain reaction. Other relatives started questioning what was going on, and one by one, some of them backed out as well. My parents had tried to handle this quietly, expecting me to accept their decision without making waves. But now, they weren't just dealing with my absence. They were losing more and more guests as word spread. The trip that was supposed to be a grand family celebration was now overshadowed by tension and conflict. And all I had done was tell the truth at the right moment. The chaos that followed was beyond anything I had anticipated. For years, my parents had maintained the illusion of unity, pretending that any issues in the family were handled peacefully and privately. But with the truth out in the open, and my grandmother leading what was essentially a rebellion, their carefully constructed facade crumbled. What had started as a conflict between my parents and me grew into something much bigger. My absence from the trip was no longer a minor inconvenience. It became a symbol of the family's deeper fractures. People had always suspected my parents favored my brother and Jessica, but now they had undeniable proof. As the days passed, the fallout from their choices became more apparent. My grandmother's public disapproval made it clear this wasn't just about me. It was a matter of principle. Several uncles and cousins began reconsidering their attendance, realizing they didn't want to be part of something so blatantly unfair. Some even reached out to me directly, asking if the rumors were true. I didn't sugarcoat it. If I had learned anything from this situation, it was that the only way to fight manipulation was with truth. And the truth alone was enough to make people rethink their stance. Meanwhile, my brother remained silent. That was unusual for him. He always liked to control the narrative. He had been vocal at the start, but now, in the middle of the storm, he disappeared. I knew it wasn't accidental. He was waiting for everything to settle, hoping to avoid accountability. But if he thought he could sit back and watch from the sidelines, he was wrong. Eventually, when things became truly unmanageable for my parents, I finally got a call from him. This time, his tone wasn't calm or diplomatic. It was pure rage. Without hesitation, he accused me of ruining the trip. He said everything had spiraled out of control because I had made a scene. That if I had been mature about it, none of this would have happened. According to him, my absence wasn't the issue. The problem was that I had influenced others, that by standing my ground, I had turned what should have been a family celebration into a full-blown disaster. I let him speak, listening with the patience of someone who already knew exactly what to say. When he finished, I responded with the same calm he had completely lost. I asked him if he truly believed this was my fault, or if deep down he knew the real issue was how they had excluded Daniel. I asked if he had even considered the position they had put me in, forcing me to choose between my marriage and my family. There was silence. For a moment, I thought he might admit it, but instead he clung to his argument, saying I was overreacting and should have handled things more intelligently without causing a scene. I laughed. A cold, humorless laugh. Even after everything, he still had the audacity to make me feel like the guilty one. I made it clear this was his problem, not mine. If the trip was ruined, it was because he and Jessica had manipulated our parents. If he didn't like the consequences, maybe he should have thought twice before letting his wife dictate who belonged in our family. He tried to downplay everything, insisting that we were still family and that I should just move on. That was when I knew none of them had ever truly cared about fixing this. They only wanted to preserve their illusion of control. The next call came from my mother, but this time she sounded different. No more guilt trips, no more superiority. She sounded exhausted. She said she didn't want to fight anymore, that things had gotten out of hand, that my father was hurt by how everything had turned out. She insisted they had never meant to make Daniel feel unwelcome, that they were only trying to prevent conflict. I answered with calm, unwavering firmness. If they truly wanted to fix things, they needed to take responsibility. What hurt me the most wasn't just that they had sided with Jessica. It was that even after everything, they still showed no real remorse. Her response was weak, an attempt to minimize it all. She muttered that she understood how I felt, but that in the end, family should always come first. And that was exactly the problem. My mother insisted that everyone makes mistakes and that we should move forward. She still believed time would erase everything and things would return to normal. I knew then this conversation was pointless. I told her the only way to rebuild trust was for them to acknowledge the harm they had caused, and more importantly, apologize directly to Daniel. This wasn't just about me. It was about their blatant disrespect toward my husband. If they wanted to prove they had learned something, they had to start by making things right with him. There was silence. Then finally, she admitted she would think about it and talk to my father. I told her my stance wouldn't change, and I hung up. A strange calm followed. Daniel saw the tension in my face and asked what had happened. So I told him everything. How Jessica had been behind it all. How my parents had chosen to exclude him just to appease my brother's wife. His face shifted from surprise to sadness, then to resignation. He said he had always suspected Jessica didn't like him, but he never imagined she'd go so far. Then he took my hand and said something I'll never forget. He said he was grateful, not because my family accepted him, but because I had stood by him. That was all I needed to hear. Days later, my mother sent a message. She and my father wanted to talk to Daniel. No excuses, no explanations. Just a request. I don't know if I'll ever trust them again. But I do know one thing. If they want reconciliation, they need to prove they've changed. Otherwise, this distance will be permanent.